So I think I'm going to have a nice transition from your talk, going right from tobacco litigation into some of the issues that I'm going to mention today. Members of the committee, I greatly appreciate the opportunity to be here to talk with you today. And I want to use this time to reflect on how, in the same 2 decades that obesity and other chronic diseases were emerging as a public health crisis, government efforts to mitigate the crisis are confronting a very troubling trend in constitutional law. Along the way, I will highlight some viable legal and policy strategies for addressing food marketing to youth, but I'm a little bit off the hook because many of them were explored here in greater depth in the rich material from the IOM's workshop on legal strategies in childhood obesity prevention. Americans have long taken for granted that the government can regulate commercial activity in order to protect children's welfare, individual privacy, food and product safety, public health, and other important elements of our common well-being. But now policies that once seemed unremarkable are facing unprecedented constitutional challenges. In the courts, industry advocates have successfully advanced a novel interpretation of the First Amendment against government policies that address the pervasive marketing of products that lead to lifelong illness and early death. Historically, when we thought of the First Amendment, we thought of protecting unpopular voices from government retribution, not the ability of billion-dollar corporations to flood the airwaves with their promotions and points of view. But then in the 1970s, the Supreme Court extended First Amendment protection to advertising. In legal terms, commercial speech. The rationale was that advertising conveys important information to consumers and is necessary. Whoopsies. Did that go? Sorry about that. That was probably very distracting. I'll get there in a minute. The rationale was that advertising conveys important information to consumers and is necessary to the smooth functioning of our free market economy. Over the past 2 decades, the commercial speech doctrine has evolved to afford nearly the same level of First Amendment protection to corporate commercial speech as it does to individual, political, and artistic expression. And this has emerged, of course, in parallel with the political speech doctrine, culminating in the infamous Citizens United decision, which holds that as far as campaign expenditures are concerned, multinational corporations are just the same as you and me. Okay, here we go. I'm now going to describe 5 challenges that loom for public health regarding the current state of the commercial speech doctrine. The first challenge has to do with the Supreme Court's justification for extending First Amendment protection to advertising in the first place, which goes like this. Truthful advertising is essential to the smooth operation of our free enterprise system because it relays concrete information that consumers use to make, quote, intelligent and well-informed purchasing decisions. In other words, the commercial speech doctrine is built on a rational choice theory of human behavior. This view has led the majority of Supreme Court justices to reject what they characterize as paternalistic government efforts to protect the public welfare by keeping people in the dark for what the government perceives to be their own good. As we all know, accusations of paternalism, or nanny statism, depending on your gender preferences, are common political barriers to all sorts of public health regulations. But they also become legal barriers when it comes to regulating commercial advertising. The premise is that the government shouldn't meddle in what commercial speakers have to say to consumers, because adults are perfectly capable of digesting all of this information in order to make logical economic decisions. Moreover, because, in the words of the Supreme Court, the benefits from the commercial speech derive from confidence in its accuracy and reliability, false and, in the court's terms, inherently misleading advertising is not protected. That said, the legal construction of what counts as inherently misleading advertising is markedly narrow, given that most advertising is practically synonymous with emotional manipulation. Of course, the fallacy in all of this is becoming clearer as research about how humans really make decisions is emerging from fields including neuroscience, behavioral economics, developmental psychology, and addiction studies. As this research builds, if scientists strategically translate and disseminate their findings, they might eventually force courts to question the validity of the theory buttressing the commercial speech doctrine. Now I'm going to turn to the second challenge, namely the question of how the commercial speech doctrine treats regulations aimed at protecting children and teens. Although there is little to no First Amendment case law addressing restrictions on child-targeted advertising, the Supreme Court has indicated in other settings that government paternalism is appropriate when it comes to commercial regulations aimed at protecting children. Moreover, as we've talked a lot about today, studies on children's cognitive development shows that advertising targeted at kids, at least at kids under 12, is by definition inherently misleading and thus should not receive First Amendment protection. So it is more or less indisputable that government can ban harmful commercial advertising, or for that matter, any commercial advertising directed to younger children. Of course, the conundrum here is that the Supreme Court has made it very clear that regulations protecting children can't limit too much advertising to adults. For example, in the 2001 Supreme Court decision in Lorillard v. Riley, a ban on tobacco advertising near schools and playgrounds was struck down as overly broad because it unduly restricted the ability of tobacco companies to convey their messages to adults. Within certain child-oriented domains, however, the First Amendment does permit policymakers to limit child-targeted advertising. For one, school authorities have a lot of leeway to determine what types of commercial messages, if any, are allowed on school property. If school districts are resorting to advertising revenues to fill their shrinking coffers, they can at least exclude ads for unhealthy foods and beverages. And I want to emphasize that it is politics and not the First Amendment that stand in the way of well-tailored restrictions on games aimed at children, ads and product placements on children's TV, and the use of cartoon characters to promote obesogenic foods and beverages. So where do teens fit into all of this? We've talked a lot about this today. On the one hand, in a recent case involving age restrictions on extremely violent video games, the Supreme Court said that older minors have free speech rights to be exposed to offensive digital images and ideas. It wouldn't be surprising if the court applied the same approach to the right of adolescents to be exposed to commercial advertising. On the other hand, thanks to the work of Catherine and a few other pioneering researchers, there was a growing recognition at the highest levels that adolescents merit special protections when it comes to digital marketing practices that exploit their cognitive vulnerabilities. This is another area where a burgeoning body of scientific research may well be on the verge of shaping new legal principles. The third challenge is where the law is moving with regard to the type and amount of scientific data that the government must be able to muster to justify a commercial speech regulation. We've talked a bit about a recent federal appeals court case regarding the new tobacco control law requiring cigarette packs to include large graphic health warnings issued by the FDA. In selecting 9 images that would effectively convey the negative health effects of smoking, the FDA relied on evidence, including international studies showing that graphic warnings cause people to think more about quitting, as well as an FDA consumer study focusing on the salience measures reported for a set of 36 proposed images. The appeals court struck down the FDA's chosen images, interpreting Supreme Court precedent to require the FDA to quantify, quote, with statistical precision, how much the graphic warnings would reduce smoking rates. Quote, the FDA has not provided a shred of evidence that the graphic warnings will directly advance its interest in reducing the number of Americans who smoke. It remains to be seen if this is the final decision on the matter, but other courts in similar cases have held the government to a less exacting standard. There is a real possibility, however, that this reading of Supreme Court precedent will prevail. I don't need to spell out for this audience how requiring conclusive proof of a direct causal impact would affect the viability of policy proposals regarding food marketing to youth. But even under this standard, policymakers might succeed if they take an open look at the harms they are trying to prevent. For example, if the government can't show that a particular regulation will reduce childhood obesity rates, maybe it can show that the regulation is going to protect children's privacy or some aspect of their psychological well-being. Scientists studying the impact of contemporary food marketing on children could make a major contribution by helping us identify and explain these types of upstream harms caused by this marketing. And at the same time, researchers can try to influence courts' approach to evidence by publicizing the need to take a risk factors approach to complex, multi-causal problems like childhood obesity. A fourth challenge involves determining what types of commercial products and activities fall under the protective umbrella of the commercial speech doctrine. An essential element of the strategy of industry advocates over the past few decades has been to characterize non-expressive business practices as protected speech. Take, for example, free product samples. The new federal tobacco control law limits where tobacco samples can be distributed in order to ensure that an addictive, deadly product does not end up in the hands of children. One court viewed this as a simple restriction on where a product may be circulated in commerce. But another court found that a tobacco sampling regulation must be treated with greater suspicion as a government limitation on protected speech. The court viewed handing out a free sample as an inherently expressive activity. The Supreme Court has recently indicated a shift toward applying stringent First Amendment review to what would appear to be ordinary business regulations. Still, the question of which commercial practices count as protected speech remains far from settled, and policymakers should not be dissuaded from addressing food marketing simply because companies may raise First Amendment objections. No matter where the Supreme Court takes this, it is probably safe to say that corporate free speech rights will not be implicated by a zoning restriction on the location of chain restaurants, by a law requiring different sizes of a beverage product to have the same per ounce price, by a law setting minimum nutritional standards for children's restaurant meals, by a law prohibiting children from buying highly caffeinated energy drinks, or, to take a hot current example, by a portion size restriction on sugar-sweetened beverages. The final challenge I want to share with you is this. While corporate speakers have been securing the First Amendment right to amplify their messages, they have simultaneously been working to stifle government messages regarding public health. Let's look at 3 recent government efforts to inform the general public about issues that are critical to public health. First, we have the Federal Interagency Working Group, which developed but never released recommendations on what food is appropriate to market to children in the midst of an obesity crisis. Second, we have the FDA, which at least for now cannot implement a set of graphic tobacco warnings depicting the extreme hazards of smoking. And third, there's the town of Richmond, California, where a soda tax measure is on tomorrow's ballot. In that instance, a court blocked a local law requiring that campaign flyers disclose major funding from large out-of-city contributors. In each example, the affected industries painted simple informational messages coming from the government as a coercive violation of corporate free speech rights. And in each instance, at least thus far, their framing has won the day in either the political or the judicial sphere. Never mind the practical reality that cash-strapped public agencies are competing for attention against industries that are spending billions upon billions of dollars promoting products that are fueling a chronic disease crisis and elevating our nation's healthcare costs. So what's to keep the government's message from being completely drowned out? There's a growing momentum in the public health field to pursue SSB taxes that earmark revenues in part for counter-marketing campaigns like the ones we just heard about. These revenues won't match industry marketing budgets, but as we heard from Cheryl, strategic, hard-hitting counter-marketing campaigns can be extremely effective. Government agencies can also use their enforcement powers to shine a bright light on dubious food marketing practices. Often, even the prospect of an investigation will inspire reform. Think of how quickly, after government agencies announced investigations, the Smart Choices program blew up, and Kellogg pulled Cocoa Krispy boxes that claimed to support your child's immunity. Finally, the government can lead by example. The First Amendment leaves policymakers a lot of leeway to determine what type of promotional activities are allowed on government property, if not via their regulatory power, then via their procurement power. By setting nutrition and marketing standards for products served or sold in places like schools, parks, and hospitals, the government can carve out safe spaces for children to experience what a healthy environment actually looks and feels like. All right, I'm trying one more time. There we go. In closing, I want to acknowledge that our current legal and for that matter, political climate, poses formidable challenges for government efforts to address the pervasive marketing of obesogenic foods and beverages to our nation's youth. But thankfully, our constitutional system is designed to balance competing interests and to adapt to new technological developments, scientific discoveries, and social norms. This means that the door is never closed to public health researchers, advocates, and policymakers who are committed to using the tools of their respective trades to combat marketing practices that endanger children's welfare, individual privacy rights, community health, and other fundamental American values. Finally, I just want to be sure to thank my trusted co-authors on publications that laid the foundation for this presentation, namely Ted Merman, Tamara Piety, Dale Kunkel, and Jennifer Harris.